Good morning. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning.
We are continuing in Tanya. We're up to chapter 23, and we are in the middle of a building that the Alter Rebbe is structuring, layer by layer, a fundamental difference in the way that we understand the world. And over the last few chapters, from chapter 18 through now, the Alter Rebbe introduced us to some pretty heavy Kabbalistical ideas. His main point was that God is one. Not to the meaning that there's only one God as exclusion of all others, but God is oneness. Everything is God. That's some words that I just said. What does it actually mean? So as the Alter Rebbe explained at length, it means that because of God's immense difference and how much higher he is, and how much greater he is, and how much he is beyond our little tiny puny universe, from God's perspective, everything is included within him. The same way for you, one hair on your head is part of you, right? You're not a different person before and after you grew a single hair. Now, does that hair exist? Yes. You can cut it off and it can separate and you can use it for a DNA test. That hair exists. But from your perspective, we're talking about almost nothingness. Because it's also part of who you are. And that is, from God's perspective, the idea of everything is God. It's discussed at length much later in Tanya in later sections. Now, the problem is that we as humans sit here and look around the world and the room, and we see many things that are not God. And how can I possibly see something neutral, a random table, or, to the extreme, something negative, a sinful thing, idol worship? And the answer is that for those things to exist, God has to hide himself. God has to put up some smoke and mirrors. He has to disguise his identity as the creator so that something can exist outside of him. The same way we use the analogy of if there's someone in charge of a company, so there are certain people that they deal with on a regular basis, and they obviously know who the owner is. But then maybe the person wants a bit of anonymity. They want to disguise themselves. And so the random employee on the street doesn't deal with the boss directly. They deal with the manager who deals with this regional manager who deals with the boss and the board of directors. And there's so many levels and disguises, and the company name switches a couple of times, that the security guard might not even realize that they're talking to the boss. And they'll stop the person walking to their own company saying, "Sir, you don't belong here." What was that process? The board of directors that deal with him every day and the employee, the security guard at the front desk, are both part of the same company. They both exist within the world created by this owner, but they have two vastly different experiences. One, the owner chooses to have a relationship with, and one, the owner chooses specifically to disguise himself for whatever reason you can imagine. When we're talking about God, everything in the world is divided by this as well. Certain things are the things that express and are connected to God directly. Certain things don't experience that connection. And sort of a big neutral ground here, but we'll talk about the extremes first. An idol, obviously, does not feel that very strong connection, does not express God's presence in the world. It expresses the exact opposite. Now, how does it exist? Because God, in order to give free choice, hides himself. But the other side of that equation is that because this idol is not really what God wants. Does God want there to be idols in the world? No. In order for God's greater plan to be in play, he has to create idols as well, along with everything else that exists. In last week's chapter, we called that chitzonius haratzon, the external version of desire. I don't really want this. I just, want something else, so I have this, right? If someone works at a job where they do a task they don't specifically find interesting? Do they want to go to work and move boxes? No. But why do they do it? Because they have an internal desire to have a paycheck and have food. And even that, is the money their real desire? Or is it the stuff that they buy so they can survive? Right? So you can have this onion sort of different desires that depending on where you are, is this what you really want? Is it what you really, really want? And that is that range going from the external desires to the internal, pneumios, real desires that we have. And with God, it's like that as well. There's a range of things of God. How does God really want that item? And the more God really wants that item, the more godliness is expressed in that item. The more that is a godly item. Everyone with me so far? Roughly? We're talking about what in this world expresses and lives and exudes godliness. And it's very much dependent on exactly how much God really wants it. And I just want to always give this preface because we're going to continue to use a lot of humanizing words for God. And we can have a whole 10-hour discussion. What does it mean that God wants, and what does it mean that God doesn't want, and what does it mean? All of these things are we sort of have to get past that mental point. But once we understand that we're using human terminology, we can understand some abstract concept as it relates to God. So that is our baseline. Everything in the world is part of God. It is godliness 100%. But from our perspective, there's a very big range. Some things are godly. A Torah scroll is godly. And lahavdil, to separate, an idol is completely ungodly. Which means, if you wanted to experience a connection to God, where would you find that?
I look for it when I come in here, and I put on my talis and tefillin, and I get this, and I read the early morning blessings, followed by the morning prayers, and if I'm on my own, I do it out loud, because there I have a feeling that perhaps I can connect with God. I may not feel Him, but I want Him to feel me, because God knows us much better than we know Him.
So Gershon just summarized the rest of the chapter. So great job. That's great. I'm glad that we're thinking along the same line. Because if we think about what is the most connected to God? The act of doing a mitzvah. Later on, in the end of the chapter, we'll go even deeper and say what's even more connected is learning Torah, as we'll discuss that difference. But for right now, we're starting with doing a mitzvah. In fact, the mitzvos are so part of God and what He really wants, and they're so in tune with godliness, that the mitzvos are compared to the limbs of our body. Now, if there's one thing about a healthy limb, it's that in order to get a limb to move, you don't have to send it a 10-day notice, and you don't have to file permits, and you don't have to ask its opinion. You don't even have to send a thought, right? God forbid if someone has to consciously think to move their arm up and down, that means something's not healthy. Our body should be so in sync with our desires that these things happen as it's just an extension of who we are. That's what a limb is. It's an extension of who we are. It just acts exactly in accordance with where we want it to go. Hopefully, in a healthy situation. And so when we call the mitzvos God's limbs, again, God is not a
What are the three things about mitzvos? It's a mental, it's an act, and it's a...
Speech.
Speech, yes.
Yes.
Well, you haven't touched on all of them.
That's correct. Very, very good observation, because we're going to see how when we're starting at the bottom of the pyramid.
Definitely the bottom.
Yeah. We're starting with action.
Yes.
How even the action...
Okay.
Yep, good calling out, because yes, we're going to continue to address that. That's why we're going to say Torah is even a loftier connection for that reason, and for other reasons also, as we'll see. But when we say that the mitzvos are the 248 limbs of the King, of God, as the Zohar states, we're not describing God as some sort of tentacle monster, God forbid, with 248 limbs. we're describing 248 means of expression, right? What do I use my limbs for? To interact, to connect, to do something, right? They're my interface with the world around me. And that is what the mitzvos are as well. They are God's interface with the world, but they're so connected with God. What's the difference if I use a robot to do something that I have to control on my phone and it goes and it does something, or if I just use my hand to do it? The action was done. However, the connection to me is much, much closer.
It's much more.
Much closer, much more intimate, much more personal. And that is exactly what happens when we do one of the 248 positive commandments. When we do that, at that moment, we are connecting to God. That's what a limb does. It connects, it interfaces. We're connecting to God, and we're connecting to God on such a high level that the limbs are part of who He is, the same way that our limbs are part of who we are. We'll read those inside, and then we'll continue to explain. This is starting on page 2. David, I specifically changed the copy setting, so hopefully it works better this time.
Oh, well, thank you for noticing.
Im kol haniskar la'el, yuvan v'yivayer hetiv b'tesis bir masher omru b'zayer de'retzev kutshubrich kulachad. In light of what has been said above, we can better understand and more fully and clearly elucidate the statement in the Zohar that the Torah and God are entirely one. We're going to put a pin in that because we're going to continue in the second chapter. It's not the second chapter. In the second half of this chapter, when we talk about Torah specifically, we'll revisit it. And the comment and the commentary in Tikkun is there that the 248 commandments are the 248 organs of the divine King. What exactly does that mean? Continuing on page 3. Lefi, shehamitzvos hein pnimiyus ratzein elyon v'cheftzei amiti, hamelubish b'chol ha'elamis elyenim v'chtenim l'chiyusam. For the mitzvos constitute God's innermost will and His true desire, which is clothed in all the upper and lower worlds, thereby giving them life. When we spoke about desire, we spoke about external desires, right? Someone goes to work. So when we described in that moment how there's 3 levels to their desire. They want to go to work. Do they really want the work? No, they'd rather be sitting on a beach. What do they want to do? They want to get money. Now, do they really care about the money itself? I mean, some people, just the number of the bank account is an important barometer for them. But for other people, even the money itself is a means to an end. And so when we talk about what does God want, God has to want anything that exists. Everything serves a purpose. But is it a means to an end, or is it the end itself? When God creates chairs, is it because God finds chairs interesting and wants them? Or it's because He wants something to be done with the chairs? And the answer is God always wants something more. It's always a means to an end until we get to what is the end? Doing a mitzvah. That is God's innermost desire. That is God's most actual, most true, what He really wants. What does God really, really want out of this whole wacky experiment we call the universe? Mitzvahs to be done. And that's why everything is energized and everything has power, and all for one purpose, so that we can do mitzvahs. Key. Kol chayusam v'shpuam tali b'maisa hamitzvos atachtenim k'neda. The very life and sustenance of all the world is dependent upon the performance of the mitzvahs by the creatures of the lower world, as it's known that performing a mitzvah draws godly life and sustenance into all the worlds. I will say that in this chapter, there's going to be quite a few other Kabbalistic ideas that are expressed. Very often, the Alter Rebbe connotes that with a kenoda, as it's known. We are not those that know yet. We're very much in the beginning of our Hasidic and Kabbalistical journey. And so with these ideas, I'll explain them, I'll translate them, but I don't want us to get too far lost in the trees that we lose sight of the forest, which is a problem that very often happens when we learn Tanya, that every line of Tanya could be unpacked and discussed. You can have a whole week class on just a couple of lines. And I don't want that to happen. I want us to maintain a general bird's eye view picture of the whole forest. And so an idea like this, very simply speaking, is that when we do a mitzvah, in addition to all the connections that are happening, we are drawing down energies, or drawing down vitality and life force into the world. And we'll leave it at that for now. V'nimtza, It follows that the performance and fulfillment of the mitzvahs is the innermost garment for the innermost aspect of God's will. What does God really want out of this whole thing? Connection. God wants us to connect with Him. How do we do that connection? Through the mitzvahs. Which means
We want Jews to
everyone.
connect to Him, or everyone.
Everyone to connect to Him.
And so when the Messiah is asked to come back, the world is prepared. It's not Jews that have done enough mitzvahs, it's the whole world.
Yes.
Because the Jews have taught
Yes.
the non-Jews the mitzvahs. That's
Absolutely.
And because God created mankind. He didn't say, I'm creating mankind and you can only have one religion.
Yeah. As we discussed at length, I don't want to get too, but George bringing up a great point. How we're going to be discussing, as I mentioned before, Tanya is a book by the Jews and for the Jews. And so it's very much discussing our relationship with God. There are other discussions that are to be had about the relationship as it exists with everyone else. But God, what does God really want? Again, if we can use such words, and obviously with all the caveats and asterisks that entails, God wants connection. How is that connection built? Through doing mitzvahs. And therefore, when we do a mitzvah, we are connecting and we are actualizing God's innermost desires. Continuing on page 4. Since it is due to this performance of the mitzvos that the light and life of the worlds issues forth from the divine will to be clothed in them. Right? Because why does God really want the world? Not for the world's sake. He wants it for mitzvos to be done. In fact, the Medrash tells us that when God created the world in the 6 days of creation, it was on condition. It was conditional. God said, if the Jewish people are going to accept the Torah and live the life of Torah, then you'll stay existing. But if the Jewish people opt out and they don't want the Torah, then that means that this whole experiment failed and will undo creation. Because that's really why the whole world was created. God doesn't need beautiful mountains and valleys and any of those things for its own sake. God built and God actualizes and gives life to all of those because of the mitzvos that are going to be done within that world. Hence, the mitzvos that are figuratively described as the organs of the king, for just as the organs of the human body are a garment for its soul and are completely and utterly surrendered to it. Kimiyad she'ela b'ratzin shel adam lisfet yadei raglei heim nishma'es l'ritzonei take from yad bli shum tzivui v'amira lehen uvli shum shehiyah klal. As is evident from the fact that as soon as a person desires to stretch out his hand or foot, they obey his will immediately, without any command or instruction to do them, with no delay whatsoever. Ela kirega mamish k'sha'al b'ritzonei, but at the very instant that it enters his will to do so. Our limbs, again, hopefully, with God's help, we should continue to be healthy. Our limbs are so in tune with what we want. We is a sort of a weird phrase to be using, because what is consciousness and what is that? But we know who we are. And when I want to do something, my limb is so in tune with it, it just happens automatically. And that's because my limbs are very, very much nullified and connected to me. They're not an external thing. They're not a spare part. They're nothing. There's nothing. It's an extension of my hand. It's an extension of who I am. And that is exactly how it works, or exactly is with God. As we continue on page 5. Kach derech mashal. Hachayis shall ma'isa hamitzvos v'kiyumum hu batel legamri legabe ratzon elyon hamubish by v'naseb loy mamish keguf l'neshama. There is a difference when we are talking about our limbs to our body and the action of a mitzvah to God. What's the difference? Is that my limbs, I don't have to create them. I don't have to existify them. They exist, right? When I'm not using them, they're swinging at the side, right? They're there. God is recreating the world at every moment. As we discussed earlier, so we can explain briefly here, that the world's existence is unnatural. Naturally, there's only God. But God had to do all the tzimtzumim, as we discussed, all the disguises and all the things to create a space for the world. So the world's existence is unnatural. The world's natural state is not to exist. God had to create it. God had to choose to create it. And therefore, it has to be done constantly. Just like any action that we do that fights against nature. The nature of this phone, I'm not going to do that because I have my recording, but the nature of this piece of paper is it wants to be as low as possible because of gravity. So if I want it to be up, I have to be holding it up. The minute I let go, it falls. And that's what happens in the world as well, and everything within the world. It has to be constantly created by God. When God is creating something as it's being used for a mitzvah, that's a reflection, and that's a connection, that's an expression of God's innermost desire. God can be recreating the same piece of meat for weeks or months on end. First it was a cow, and then it was all the stages that it goes through. But when that meat is sitting on my Shabbos table, and I'm enjoying it as part of a mitzvah, suddenly, what kind of energy is coming through here? What kind of life force? What kind of connection? God's innermost desire. The one that's so completely nullified to him, because this is what he wants. Did we read the first paragraph in English yet?
We're on the top.
On the top, right?
Page 5.
Just
as the...
No, sorry, I was asking if we read it out loud. I don't think we did.
if we did.
I don't think we did.
No, I don't think we
And
did.
if not, we'll read it again. Just as the organs of the human body are completely united with one soul and surrendered to it, so too the life force, animating the performance and fulfillment of the commandments, completely surrendered to the divine will which is clothed therein, and this life force becomes, in relation to the divine will, like a body to a soul. If we imagine us doing something, right? Again, I'm going to use this example of when we interact with the world around us. Either we can use a robot to do it, right? You can send your robot vacuum to go mop your floor. It was done. You caused it to happen, but as far as anyone's locally is concerned, you weren't even there, right? Because you could be across the world and you use your app and you send the robot vacuum to clean the floor. So you are responsible for it, but it's so removed to you, and that's why if the robot vacuum battery dies or if it gets stuck, it's done. There's nothing you can do about it. It's sort of outside of your control. It's not you personally. Then there's the idea of one time you're on all fours scrubbing with your hands. The floor is being cleaned. The same thing is happening, but now we're talking about it in a much more personal, much more connected. It's so me doing it that it's my arm. Nothing will get in the way of it happening because my mind wants to do it and my arms are the ones actualizing it. There's no middlemen, there's no degrees of separation, there's no disguises, there's nothing there. And that's what we're talking about. When God is actualizing the world, when God is existifying, I don't know if that's a real word, but it's it's one of those words that make a lot of sense in the context of
You created a new word.
It's definitely not my invention. It's one of those things that it's a word that Kabbalistically speaking makes a lot of sense, and so therefore I was reading an article about language, and one of the most confusing words is the word halachically. Halacha is an English word. Ik is an English suffix, right? And li is also. So it's a Hebrew word with two English. Halachically is one of the most confusing words in the Hebrew language. I don't even know what language you call it at that point. So when God is existifying the world, that could be done in many different ways. This same table, in all the moments that God is just existing for the sake of existing, it's like God doing it through the robots, through the tzimtzumim, whatever you want to call it. But the moment that we're using it for a mitzvah, we're all sitting at these tables now, we're using it for a mitzvah. Suddenly, what's existifying this table? God's innermost desire. And so the connection that we're experiencing at that moment, and because this is, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain in the next step, this is not just talking about the items around us as well. When my arm, regularly, when it's just doing nothing, what's existifying it? God's external desires, right? God needs me to have a hand so that when I do a mitzvah, right, there's sort of stages of separation. But when I use that arm to give money to a charity box, when I use my feet to run to do a mitzvah, what's existifying my feet at that moment? God's innermost desire. Because it's being used actively for a mitzvah. Likewise, the external garment of the divine soul of the person fulfilling and practicing the commandment, i.e. its faculty of action, which is external compared to the faculty of speech and thought, since it functions outside oneself. Joy noticed this very beginning in our class. We're starting from the bottom. We're talking about the power of action. What's existifying my power of action right now? God's internal desire. Who mislabish b'chayesh shel ma'aseh mitzvahs v'naseh gamkin keguf l'neshama rotzei elyon ubatil v'gamri, clothes itself in the vitality of the performance of the mitzvah, and thus it too becomes like a body to a soul in relation to the divine will and is completely surrendered to the divine will, i.e. the soul's power of action becomes united with the divine will in the same way as one's body is united with his soul. Al-Kain. In this way, those organs of the human body which perform the mitzvah, i.e. those organs in which the divine soul's faculty of action is closed during the performance of the mitzvah, they too become a veritable vehicle, literally merkava, for the divine will. We spoke about this in the past, but I'll bring it up again. What's the idea of a merkava, a chariot? So we don't deal with chariots, we deal with cars. And these days, this idea is slipped on its head because people want their cars to drive themselves. But for a very long time, there was this comparison that you can make between the horse and the chariot. Because yes, they're both listening to the driver's instructions. But the horse has its own mind, it has its own desires. If it sees some grass, maybe it will be distracted, maybe not, depending on its training, depending on how hungry it is. But the horse has its own opinion in the matter. The chariot does not. The chariot is an inanimate object. It's following exactly where the driver is directing it. And that's a difference of when we are connected, when we listen to God. Is it with our own whatever's mixed in? Or is it completely 100% nullified to God's desires? It's just going along the way that God sets it up to go. This joke applied until about 10 years ago. If your car starts going in the direction that you don't want it to go, you have to bring it to the mechanic as soon as possible. There's a problem with it. These days, that's not true. I mean, everyone's car is specifically going in its own direction.
Have driverless cars now.
Exactly, and so the whole thing falls apart. But the idea of that our body is so in tune with what God wants. Because when my arm is reaching out to get a second Danish, what is it doing that for? So, there might be external reasons that I need the Danish for food. We can trace back of why it's good or not good. But there's degrees of separation between my action and what God really wants. But when that same arm is stretching out to do a mitzvah, it's so embodying what God wants, a mitzvah to be done, that it's building the strongest connection and the strongest nullification. It's, practically speaking, part of God. The same way our limbs are part of who we are. As he continues on page 6 with a specific example, for example, the hand which distributes charity to the poor or performs another commandment becomes, in the act of performing mitzvah, a chariot for the divine will. V'raglayim hamahalachis lidvar mitzvah, v'chein hapeh v'haloshin shemdabin divrei Torah v'hamayach shemahayir b'divrei Torah v'yirah shemayim b'gdus Hashem baruch hu. Similarly, the feet which walk for the purpose of fulfilling a mitzvah, or the mouth and tongue which speak the words of Torah, or the brain reflecting on the Torah, or on the fear of heaven, or on the greatness of God, blessed be He, all of those are mitzvahs. And here we finally bring in speech and thought. When I'm using my brain to think about what's the best way to beat traffic, what experience is my brain going through? Externally connected to God. Yes, obviously my brain is still getting its energy from God, but it's tangentially related. when I'm using that same brain to reflect on God, to learn Torah as we're all doing now, what's happening in that moment? What is powering my brain? What is my brain connecting to? To God's innermost desires, what He truly wants, which is for us to do mitzvahs. Now, for us, this is we weave in and out of this. I mean, God willing, we bring more and more of this into our life, and we live more and more moments according to the mitzvahs and living this experience. But for us, it's, if we're really being honest with ourselves, this is not our default state. You know who was in this default state? Our patriarchs. Our patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's why they are called by this term, of that they were God's chariots. Ha'avos heim ha'markava. The forefathers are the markava, the chariot. What is that saying? Their entire life was this experience. Every part of their life.
When we're saying chariots, we include the horse and the chariot.
No, just the chariot.
Just the chariot.
Just the chariot. They were so in tune, they were so enmeshed with what God really wanted that their entire life was their experience. This experience that we tap into while we're doing a mitzvah, they were always in that state. As we read on the bottom of page 6, this is what the sages meant when they said that the patriarchs are truly the divine chariot. Why? What made them earn this title? On top of page 7, Shakol Everehem Kulam Hayu Kedoshim Umuvdalim Minyani Elam Hazem V'leinasu Merkava Yakuyotzin Ha'elyin Levade Kol Yameim. For all their organs were completely holy and detached from mundane matters, and throughout their life they served as a vehicle for nothing but the divine will. So that's the avos, the patriarchs. They exemplified, they lived this out fully every moment of their life with every organ. But let's get back to us. Us, definitely not tzaddikim, definitely not patriarchs. What do we experience? So the Alter Rebbe is introducing us that when we do a mitzvah, we're not just doing a good deed. We're not just, adding a check mark in the right box and we're doing, what we're supposed to be doing. But we are experiencing a moment of intense connection. That what is making our body go, what's making us go, what's making our existence in that moment is the deepest levels of God's desire, what God truly wants. Now, until now, we're discussing doing a mitzvah. And here's where, this is always a challenge, when we want to talk about the next level, but we don't want to lose what we lost. We don't want to negate what we just discussed. This idea of the connection and the enmeshment that happens when we do a mitzvah, that our very body becomes like an extension of God's body, it's being existified by one of God's limbs, so to say, is even more true when we talk about Torah specifically, learning Torah. Why? What's the difference between Torah and mitzvos? Mitzvos is an action that connects us to God. Right? So what does God want? God wants us to follow His desires. And therefore, by doing a mitzvah, we are building that connection, we're doing that. Torah is God's desires. And so when we learn Torah, right, and this is why, obviously we can all experience that our limbs are part of who we are. They're so connected to us, they're so in tune with us. But is it really who we are? If God forbid someone loses a limb, are they no longer who they were before? Them is still intact. Yes, there's a big deficiency and things change and life changes. And there's obviously, they can only do half as many things as they used to do because they're missing one of their arms. But they are still who they are. Because as close and as personal and as intimate our relationship is with our limbs, that our limbs are an extension of who we are, but it's an extension. It's not who we are directly. Right? The Alter Rebbe gives a commentary, given a...
There's a big distinction now.
Yes.
Between all of God's children and those who are in line with the Torah. There's the Torah group, and there's all of God's children. We interact, we change those around. We meaning you and us, so that it's not defined very well.
How so?
Well, right now we're talking about Jews and the Torah.
We're talking about connecting to God.
Right. How does a Buddhist or a Muslim connect to God through the Torah?
So as we're discussing in Tuesday evening,
Pardon me?
as we are discussing in our Tuesday evening class, how does someone who is not Jewish connect to God?
Noah
Right.
laws. But those are only 7. And earlier today you talked about 238
Yes.
that were critical.
Yeah.
That were active.
Yeah.
So there's a disparity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's not all of God's children.
We all have the capacity to connect. But the depth of that connection is absolutely different. The Jewish people were chosen.
And the result of the depth has to be very different.
Yeah. It ends up, absolutely. This is sort of it's not strictly related to our discussion in Tanya, but the idea that the Jewish people have a deep connection to God.
Yes.
Yes.
That has to be meaningful.
Absolutely.
More meaningful than God created all of us, as we heard from your song. Equally. No, not really.
In a previous course, we discussed the idea that we were all created in the image of God.
Correct.
Specifically, the Jewish people are referred to as God's children.
Correct. Teachers.
As God's children.
Yes.
Yes. The Jewish people definitely have a more extensive and a deeper connection, and that's why God gave us 613 means of connection to Him. Because that is our role. Our role is to connect to God the same way that you can have a very, very...
It's impossible for a non-Jew to want to watch cream after chicken. They don't, and to have only one God. It's impossible for all these people to do that unless they have this Jewish soul, which you speak about so much. This godly soul, you use it as a godly soul.
So everyone has some version of this godly soul. We're talking about how God...
The version is the key word.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's
I
all
want to just finish this.
That's
Okay.
it.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a lot going on
Yes.
here.
Yes, and that's why I think that it's sort of, the more we know, the more we like to cross-reference.
Yes, and I know nothing,
and
but I can see.
I think you're selling yourself short. I think that at this point you've been learning Torah for
2 weeks.
we're half a year at this point. You've been learning with us.
No, I don't.
The reason why I'm bringing that up is because what starts to happen is the more we cross-reference, the more it becomes we compare what we know to what we already know, and that's a beautiful thing to do, and it's an important discussion. But first we have to understand this topic, right? This topic, we're talking about how the Jewish people connect to God. Yes, that's a fascinating outcome of that conversation, is how does this relate to other people, and where else can we go with that, and where yes and where not. But right now we're discussing the idea that when we do a mitzvah, what's happening in that moment? We are connecting to God on a very, very, very deep level. We're connecting to God, instead of connecting to God, like when I'm using the same limb to grab a Danish, I'm connecting to God on a very external level. When I say connecting to God, what I mean is my connection to God in that moment is very external. Because does God really want me to be grabbing that Danish? Well, after the fact, I can go back and use that, and I can explain it, but that Danish is external to what God wants. But if I'm using that arm to give charity, a direct manifestation of what God wants me to do, God's like, this is the moment I've been waiting for. That becomes a much stronger connection, because in that moment, what is existifying me, what is powering my arm? God's innermost desires. And that's the difference of connecting to God like through a robot or connecting to God directly through a hug. Sorry, Gershon, you want to say something?
Okay. Now, the question that I heard was, how does a non-Jewish person, be they Muslim, Buddhist.
So if it's okay,
Catholic.
I don't want to get distracted by that topic right now.
How do they connect to?
Right, and I don't want to. Right,
Hashem, which is our God.
right, and that's a very important discussion. I don't want to get distracted by. It's an important discussion to have. I don't. To answer that question properly would require a lot more time than we do to do it
Okay.
justice, and so I want
So
to
let's
pause
move
that,
on.
and we'll move on to the next part of the chapter. The Alter Rebbe builds on this connection, that while a regular mitzvah is a moment of incredible connection, it's like shaking God's hand or giving God a hug. Those are still extensions, right? Our limbs are an extension of who we are. What is who we are? Right? There's a great story of the Alter Rebbe. That he was playing with one of his grandsons, the future third Rebbe of Chabad. And he was playing a game. He said, the game is called Where is Zadie? Where's Grandpa? So he asked his little grandson, Where's Zadie? So he points to his arm. He says, no, that's Zadie's arm. Points to his head. No, that's Zadie's head. Points to his heart. That's Zadie's heart. All right, so the game ended in a stalemate, and as the Alter Rebbe was walking out, so his grandson called out, Zadie. And the Alter Rebbe turned around and says, there's Zadie. Right? No specific part, but who we are. Who are we? So for us, that's a longer conversation. But when we talk about God, and here's again where that disclaimer comes in, that to say who is God is the Torah, is just words that I'm saying without understanding it. In chapter 2 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe introduces us to the idea that hu hamada, hu yodea, hu yedua. God is the knower. Right? When we learn something, there's three things happening. There's me, the knower. There's the knowledge, and there is hu amada, hu yedea, hu yedua. There's the knowledge, and there's the fact that I'm learning that knowledge. Right? There's those three steps. There's those three different things. There's the learning, the knowledge, and the knower. With God, those are all the same thing. And therefore, we understand when we're connecting to God through Torah, we are not just connecting to God's limbs, we are connecting to God Himself. And this also makes sense if we think about, our onion that we're talking about. Because we describe the onion, we describe mitzvos as the innermost layer of the onion. Right? This is the one thing that's closest to God's true desires. But what is the heart of the onion? What is God's true desires? That is Torah. And so we're a little bit splitting hairs here, and if this is, a beautiful explanation in the beauty of learning Torah specifically, not to negate the connection that happens when we do mitzvahs, not through any of that, but to build on that. And saying as much as when we connect to God through doing a mitzvah, we're connecting to God's innermost desires, but that's because we're doing the mitzvah, which is how we connect to God's innermost desires. How do we drill straight to the center of the onion? How do we connect to God Himself, to God's desires itself? That is through learning Torah. An analogy that's given for this is, if anyone's ever done a big construction job that required planning, right? The difference between the relationship that you're having with the builder and the architect. The builder is actualizing it. Nothing would happen without the builder, but at the end of the day, they're stacking bricks in your front yard. Right? They're not digging into who you are as a person. Maybe they never even met you. There's no, yes, they're actualizing your desires. You want, right? The architect doesn't touch a brick, but they do something more. They help you figure out what you want. They connect to you, right? You sit down for an interview with lots of pictures and lots of things, and they help you plan, they help you uncover what your desire actually is. Both of them are important parts. But if we're looking at a hierarchy of who's connected more, who's connected to you on a deeper level, the architect is more in tune with your desire than the builder, right? Especially when you have multiple builders doing different parts, and each one, the carpenter or the electrician doesn't know what the final product is going to look like. They know that you need an outlet in every room, and therefore they're doing that, and they're actualizing your desires, and they're connecting to you on that level. But who knows what you really desire? Who knows the full picture? Who's connected with your desires as opposed to... That's the architect. And that is what we connect to when we're learning Torah. Yes, doing a mitzvah is an incredible moment of connection. It's a moment when my very hand is connected to God in the innermost way, the same way I'd be giving God a hug, connecting to Him limb to limb as opposed to through a bunch of intermediaries. But connecting to God Himself, that is done through learning Torah specifically. as we'll continue to explain on the bottom of page 7. Ach, hamachshava v'hahiru b'divrei Torah sheb'mayach, v'koyach hadiber b'divrei Torah sheb'peh, him levushim hapnimim shel nefesh elikis. But the thought and meditation on the words of the Torah, which is accomplished in the brain, and the power of speech engaged in the words of Torah, which is in the mouth, these being the innermost garments of the divine soul, and thus closer to the soul itself than the faculty of action, the external garment. Continuing on page 8. And surely the divine soul itself, which is clothed in them, i.e. the thought and speech engaged in the Torah, right? Because there's a soul. We discussed that length in earlier chapters. But in every action that I do, there's a soul power that's powering it. My power of speech, my power of thought, my power of action. And when I'm doing a mitzvah, that's my godly soul's powers that we're utilizing right now. We discussed this in length earlier. I don't want to get too far off track. All of them are fused in perfect unity with the divine will, and not merely a vehicle, a chariot for it. As are the mouth and brain, in which the thought and speech of Torah take place. The idea of Merkava, of a chariot, is a beautiful metaphor of something that's so in tune with you, so connected with you. Right? If you have an old school car, you really get to know a car. You know exactly, you want to make a slight turn. It's an extension of your hands practically, but it's not you. But you can walk away from the chariot. The chariot is absolutely a separate entity. There's absolutely a division there. And that's the difference between the beauty of connection through a mitzvah, when yes, it's 100% in tune, it's like one of God's limbs, as opposed to Torah, which is God's desire itself. Why? Because what is God's desires? And this is goes back to an idea we discussed earlier. We discussed the incredible connection, I think it was chapter 4 or 5, of the Torah, is I might be learning, right? Here we're learning lofty ideas, so it's easier to connect with this concept of we're connecting to God. What if I'm learning Jewish law? What if I'm learning Jewish law? Jewish law is very low, technical, very basic, right? I learn about two people come to court and one of them is lying. It doesn't feel like I'm connecting to very high supernal levels. But the fact of the matter is that God's desire is that when Mr. A and Mr. B both come to court, one of them says, it's mine, one of them says, it's mine, the law should be whatever the law is. That idea is God's desires. Yes, it's God's desires as it filters down to this world, but it's God's desires. The kernel of that is God's desires. And therefore, when I learn Torah, I'm connecting to God's desire itself. When I do a mitzvah, I'm doing something that connects me to what God wants. I'm building a house based on what the architect's plans are. But when I learn Torah, I'm tapping into the desires itself. I'm tapping into God himself, as we will continue to explain. For the divine will is identical with the halachic subject of which one thinks and speaks, inasmuch as all of the laws of halacha are particular expressions of the innermost desire with divine will itself. Shekach Allah b'rtzeni yisbarich shedavar zeh muter, a kasher, a pasul, a zakay, a lehepech. For God willed it thus, that a particular thing be deemed permissible or kosher, or that this person be found exempt or another innocent or reverse, whatever the law is. Okay? When I am eating a piece of kosher meat, let's work this backwards. If I have a question about a piece of meat, I don't know if this piece of meat is kosher or not. So, when I eat it, when I find out that it's kosher and I eat it, that means that I am acting based on God's desires. God's desire is that it be kosher, and therefore I'm eating it for a mitzvah and I say a bracha, and so I'm acting on the fact that this is God's desires. But when I learn about the fact, why is it kosher, or that it is kosher, I'm drilling straight to the heart of the matter. I'm connecting to God's desire itself. Both of them are beautiful, and I don't want to take away, I don't want them to walk away and saying, mitzvahs are second rate, and I'm not going to do them anymore, as we'll continue to see in a moment. But the truest connection, the purest connection that we can have with God is specifically through learning Torah, because learning Torah connects us to God's desire itself, as opposed to doing something based on God's desire. Continuing on page 9. V'chein chol tzirufei oisius ternavim ksuvim heim hamshachis asim v'chamasim v'chedes be'ein seif baruch hu b'tachas hayichud shu ha'idei v'hu hamad ha'chulu. Similarly, all the letters and combinations of the Pentateuch, prophets, and writings are also expressions of God's will and wisdom, which are united with blessings Ein Sof in a perfect union, since He is the knower, the knowledge, and the subject known, as we explained in chapter 2 and earlier. V'zeu shekasav de'aryaisu v'kutshabrichu kul echad v'loi eivarin d'malka l'chud kibikutin. Right, this is something that I promised we'd get back to. The very first lines of this chapter was he quoted two things, one from Zohar and one from Tikkun Zohar from the commentary. The commentary talks about the connection we have with mitzvos, that the mitzvos are the limbs of the king. So what is Torah? That is what is meant by the statement, the Torah and God are absolutely one. They are not merely organs of the king, as are the mitzvos. That's a distinction. The Torah is God. Now, the big disclaimer here is that it's hard for us to wrap our head around this. And in fact, in chapter 2, do you mind if I borrow this for a second? In chapter 2, the words that the Alter Rebbe used specifically was, I want to make sure I'm quoting it completely accurately. And this is not within the powers of any man to comprehend clearly. We cannot relate to this, because by us, even what I desire is external to me. There's me, and there's the fact that I want something. And therefore, if I get it, if I don't get it, right? In God, that distinction doesn't exist. Why not, how not? When we become expert Kabbalists, we can revisit this issue. But for now, we'll take that with faith. We'll accept the limits of our knowledge and the limits of our capabilities to understand that when we're talking about God and His desires, what does His desires mean? Torah. God and His desires are one. Which means that when we're connecting to Torah itself, we're connecting to God Himself. Which means that when I pull a code of Jewish law off the shelf, and it talks about the most basic, the most seemingly trivial, nitty-gritty ideas, right? If someone does this and this, if somebody sins, what the law is, if somebody does, all of those concepts, that, there's certain things that we learn that for all practical purposes could be in a law book, right? I read the commandment, do not steal. I could have read that in the Book of American Laws. And yet I'm reading it from the Torah. This is an expression of God's desires, which means I'm connecting to God. Not an expression. This is God's desire. Therefore, when I learn the Torah, I'm connecting to God in a much deeper way than any other way possible. Because even a mitzvah, when I then go and I don't steal, it's hard to actively perform a negative commandment. That's why I'm gonna flip it around, right? When I go and I give charity, I am acting on God's desires. But when I learn about charity, I'm connecting directly to God's desire. And that's the distinction between doing a mitzvah, a very beautiful, very deep, very intimate connection to God, and learning Torah. Continuing on page 10, where he sort of follows through on this idea. Now, since the divine will, which is in perfect unity with God Himself, stands completely revealed in the divine soul and its inner garment, i.e. its thought and speech, while the person occupies himself with the words of Torah, there is nothing obscuring the divine will at that time. It follows that at that time, the soul and its garments of thought and speech are also truly united with God. Because God is fully expressed in Torah, when I'm learning Torah, what's powering my power of thought, my power of speech? God. There's no intermediaries, there's no disguises, there's no separations, there's no degrees of difference. This is fully in tune and expressing exactly what God truly desires. With a unity comparable to God's speech and thought with His essence as explained above. we'll leave that for now. For there's nothing separate from God except as far as countenance is concealed. Right? Because God exists within everything. The only difference is it revealed or not? And therefore, when I'm learning something, when I'm connecting something where it's fully revealed, that's the ultimate. Because I am experiencing the true truth of the universe. Even more so. Moreover, their unity, i.e. the unity of the divine soul and its faculties with God, that is attained through Torah study, is even more exalted and more powerful than the unity of God's infinite light with the upper spiritual worlds. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker because the whole idea of upper spiritual worlds is kind of enigmatic at our current state of learning. But there are degrees, what we call Seder Hishtalshalos, a chain of worlds and levels between God's infinite oneness and the world that we're in existence today. And mixed in a few of those, there's separations and there's curtains and there's a lot of things going on. A few years ago we had a course called The World of Kabbalah, where we went through and explained is a very strong word, we went through and discussed all of these different parts of Seder Hishtalshalos and what they all do and what their role is. That's a discussion for another time. But the idea is that the higher up you are in the chain, the more godliness is revealed. Because the more spiritual, the more sensitive is to godliness, right? The difference of a world which is mostly God, and God is the default reality, versus our world where God is the default not reality. Therefore, what he's saying now is that no matter how up you go on that chain, their connection to God at that level is not as high as our connection to God, not as direct, not as clear as our connection to God when we learn Torah. Even though we're sitting in this lowest world where godliness is so hidden, you have to go searching for it, and even when we search it, we don't really see it, as we're going to explain in a moment. But the fact of the matter is that the connection that's happening there, the unity, is the deepest on any level. Continuing on page 11. For the divine will is actually manifest in the soul and its garments that are engaged in Torah study, since it is identical with the Torah being studied. What's occupying my intellectual powers while I'm studying Torah? Torah, right? That's hopefully what's in my mind. Which means that what is really there, because Torah, you can swap out the word Torah with God, and that's don't take that out of context, because within the context of what we're discussing, right? Not that the Torah itself is a manifestation, is God by another name. And that's the most direct connection possible, is me learning Torah with my brain. And so all of us here sitting around the table, the experience that we're having right now of connecting to God through Torah study is the deepest connection possible in all of the worlds that exist.
I'm not following the Hebrew. The repetition of the word who.
Shaharei hu, that is.
Thank you.
Either who is that is.
Thank you.
V'chol ha'elamei yenim mekabel chayusam me'or v'chayis hanimshich ma'atera shiyotzim v'chazberach ziv kulam v'chachma sisa. All of the supernal worlds receive their vitality by the way of the light and life derived from the Torah, which is God's will and wisdom, as is written, you have made them all with wisdom. Even the highest world, where are they getting their connection from? As an offshoot from Torah, from God's desires. Right? God had a desire, represented by the Torah, and therefore he created the worlds. But there's that second step. It's a cause and effect. That's already a cause and effect relationship. Right? Part of Seder Hishtalshalos, part of that chain, is the cause and effect chain reaction. God wants, so therefore he creates. God this, so therefore he that. This, that. That cause and effect is God has Torah, and therefore he creates the upper worlds. Even the most lofty upper worlds are based, so it's already a cause and effect. It's already a degree of separation. As opposed to us, when we learn Torah, when we're connected to the Torah itself. Therefore, it follows that God's wisdom by the Torah transcends them all. I'm going to read this paragraph and translate. I'm not going to explain it because it's a little extreme for our discussion. In fact, the Torah, God's will, as described as encompassing all worlds, means that it is a level which cannot become clothed in the world, but rather animates and illuminates them as if from a distance, from above, in a transcending and encompassing manner. And it is this level which transcends all the worlds, that is clothed in a truly revealed form in one's soul, and his soul garment when he studies Torah. Now, that's great. Very, very strong connection. Raise your hand if you feel that connection right now.
A connection.
A connection. But that lofty spiritual, I don't feel like I'm touching a live wire right now. Right? I don't feel like I'm connecting to the most perfect unity, that I'm tapping into God himself. I don't feel that.
You don't?
I don't. I'm a human. And therefore I don't feel that connection. But the fact of the matter is, it's still there. There's an idea it brought in one of the prophets that is describing how he was sitting there and he was experienced prophecy, but no one else around him was aware of that communication, but they all started yelling. The question is why? Right? If they don't experience the prophecy, if they're not experiencing it, why are they randomly yelling? And the answer is, Afal Gav, this is on page 12, Afal Gav the Ihu Leichazi, because the answer, the Talmud or the Medrash, whoever it is, explains, even though they didn't see it, they didn't experience the prophecy, their mazel, their spiritual, their soul experiences it. We'll use that word for this discussion. Even though we don't feel it, you know who is feeling it? Our soul. And in fact, the very reason why we're able to do this is because we don't experience it. We've discussed this at length in the past about why does God have to hide himself?
Why does what?
Why does God have to hide himself? I apologize, I'm going slightly over time. Hopefully we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. Anyone in a super rush to get out of here?
I thought it goes to 11.
Usually we try to be an hour, 9:30 to 10:30.
9:30 to 11 somewhere.
Even better. We need to do a whole 25 minutes to continue talking.
No, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I
So,
it's up to you.
So, why is it that God has to hide himself? So as we discussed, if godliness was revealed, there'd be no place for anything else. Right? It's like the I'm trying to think of a good analogy to use at this moment. But when God, if I know, if I am aware, is a word I should use. If I'm aware of God, there's no free choice. There's no possibility of going against him. There's no other experience because my true reality is being part of God. Right? And so therefore, if I, as a human being, am aware of God, and aware, I don't mean just like knowledge-based, but if I experience God, there's no place for anything else.
Wait, I'm having difficulty with that.
Okay.
We always have free will.
Do you?
Yes.
Even if there's
I mean, God knows what I'm thinking, what
So-
I'm going to do.
So
what I'm gonna
we
say.
always have free will because we were designed not to be aware of God. And I don't mean aware as in like knowledge base that I understand that there's a God and all the sort of the, but if I was actually cognizant, if I was actually looked around and I saw God, there'd be no possibility of going against him. With God in the room, how can you possibly do anything else?
Okay.
And therefore, we don't experience God in the room, right? We don't, it's hidden from us. That way we can have a normal life and we can have our own existence. And that's really the key point, is that not only would I not have free will, I wouldn't have my own existence. If I'm really aware of what God is and the relationship that I really have with God, which as we described, is like a hair, right? Let's give a single hair on your head. Let's give it some sentience. Right? It thinks that it's its own thing. It thinks that it's all powerful. I'm a very long, strong hair. The minute that sentience is aware that it's one tiny fraction of a greater body, it would lose all sense of self. Now, that's weird because we're giving sentience to a follicle for a single hair, but that same idea exists with us. We are the truth of the matter is that we are so nullified and so nothing compared to God. In relation to God, we don't exist, practically speaking. If we were aware of that, we would lose all sense of self and a sense of identity. Which means that our whole purpose of creation wouldn't have been a thing, because God wants separate things that have their own identity and yet choose to connect to them with their free will.
I don't understand the free will like David. I'm not sure, David, did you get it? Did he respond perfectly for you?
I understood
What did he
the
say?
explanation. What?
What did he say?
Well, that when God is present with us, he's taking us over, and that we're enabled to think for ourselves because of God's presence, and it's God's presence that's acting, speaking, doing for us. If that offers an explanation, but
I'm a little shaky.
I'm going to, with your permission, David, Gershon has a question. I want to just answer Gershon.
I was going to say, the Torah tells us that people say, okay, so we understand that God exists, let's have a look at him. And what does the Torah tell us? That the sons of Aaron, they got too close to him, and what happened?
They cease to exist. And that's a very good example of this. How when God is in the room, there can be nothing else but God.
As far as your choices.
Yes. My choices, and even on a deeper level, my reality.
So free will
If you
belongs to someone whose God is not in the room with him.
Yes.
Very simply put.
Absolutely.
Nothing.
Now, the truth is that God is always in the room. So what does God do? He hides himself. So we don't experience God in the room in order that we should be able to have, right? If you hold a candle in a dark room, you hold a candle in a dark room, it's bright, it's shining, it's if you hold a candle in daylight, you can barely see it.
So because he's hidden himself,
Yes.
that doesn't mean we don't know he's there.
So that's a very good distinction. We can know that God exists, but we don't experience it.
So it affects our will.
Yes. Because I can know something and yet go act against that knowledge. That's really, on a fundamental level, it's what the Alter Rebbe is building to here, is that the more we make this reality part of our life, the more we realize that every mitzvah we do, we're connecting to him on the most entrenched level. That's what allows us to overcome any obstacle. But the obstacle is still there, because the difference of if I know something and experience it, there's a, tangentially related, there's a law in Judaism that a witness can never become a judge. Because once you've experienced it, once you saw it, the facts are so set in your mind, nothing can dissuade you, right? And so if you saw something, you saw someone doing something to someone else, because you experienced that moment, there is nothing that can change you. You can have someone else come to you and argue and say it wasn't really him or something else happened.
So we're saying free will is neither good nor bad. It's aligning itself with the presence of God.
The power of free will is important,
Yes.
but it also comes from a lack of awareness of God, which is why God has to hide himself.
Which is substituting the power you're assuming.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Good. Finally. Thank you, David.
thank you, Joy.
So that is why. Why are we able to have this connection? Because we're not going to feel it. Even though we're having that connection right now, we don't feel it. And therefore, we can sort of maintain our self-identity. Right? Everything has to be matched. The more we're aware of God, well, not us, but the more the worlds are aware, they have to be limited, not to have the ultimate version. Because for them, and that's in brackets and parentheses, we're not going to delve too deeply into that. We'll save that for the next time around when we get more into the Kabbalistical stuff. That's why. What's more important? Learning Torah or doing mitzvahs? The answer is both. They both have their role, they're both important. But if we're going to make a hierarchy, Torah inches above all else. The Mishnah tells us that Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. A whole list of very, very important mitzvahs, but Talmud Torah, learning Torah, goes above and beyond. Why? Well, now we understand. Because when we're talking about the level of connection to God, Torah gives us a deeper connection. We're on middle of page 12. This discussion of the exalted unity of God with God attained through Torah study, which is even greater than that accomplished by performing the mitzvahs, explains why Torah study is so much loftier than all the other commandments, including even prayer, which affects unity within the supernal worlds. Now, you might ask, if that's true, why don't we learn Torah 24/7? Right? Why do I stop learning Torah to do any other mitzvah? The answer is that we can't really exist learning Torah 24/7. And once we're stopping, we do all the other mitzvahs as well. There are certain people who, they're called Torasei Umnaso. Torah is their occupation. Their entire life revolves around Torah, and therefore they're exempt from certain mitzvahs. Us, that's not how we usually connect with Torah. And usually by the time we start learning Torah, we're already looking at the clock, or we're looking to, take a break, or when can I get my coffee, when I'm hoping my phone will ring, because our connection to Torah we're human, and therefore we don't have this all-encompassing thing. Therefore, we also do the other mitzvot because they're also very important. As he explains in the brackets and parentheses, although the law requires that anyone whose Torah study is not his entire occupation, that he interrupt his study for prayer, which would seem to indicate that prayer surpasses Torah study, this is only because he would in any case pause and interrupt his studies, and in fact there are definitely some things, if you're learning Torah, you're exempt from other mitzvahs. If somebody is learning Torah and there's other mitzvahs that come up, and they could be done by someone else, and it's not so important for you to do them, you're not required to do them, but we're not getting into that now, that's a bit of a different conversation. But ultimately,
I don't have to go Shabbat.
so that's the question of who else is going to do it if you don't, and that's why it's
I like to cook Shabbat.
in order to be exempt from cooking Shabbat dinner, you'd have to be learning Torah from now until Shabbat. No breaks, no anything, because once you take a break, you're responsible for everything else as well. Continuing on page 13, I'm going to briefly address this. This is sort of a definitely going way more overtime than I expected. I'll explain this idea briefly, then we'll read it inside, and I'm happy to stay after and discuss it further. This connection should build within us a certain sense of awe. When we study Torah, right, we shouldn't take a Torah book, lounge on the beach, and start studying. Because what's happening when we're learning Torah? We are connecting to the most intimate, most deepest levels of godliness. We're connecting to God Himself. And therefore, there has to be a certain sense of awe, not fear, right? But awe of what I'm doing and I'm learning Torah. It might seem that I'm just reading a book. So instead of reading fiction, I'm reading Torah. Right, I'm also doing a mitzvah. 2 thumbs up. No, it's so much more than that. The moment I'm learning Torah, I'm connecting to God Himself. At the deepest level possible in the entire universe. That idea itself, when we really internalize that, leads us to a great sense of awe in our relationship with God. As we continue on page 13. From this explanation of the lofty stature of Torah study, the wise man will be able to draw down upon himself a sense of great awe as he engages in the study of the Torah. When he considers how his soul and its garments of thought and speech are found within his brain and mouth, are truly fused in perfect unity with the divine will and the infinite light of the Ein Sof that manifests in them, i.e. the soul and his garments when he studies Torah. This infinite light manifest in one's Torah study is of such a lofty level that all the upper and lower worlds are truly as naught in comparison with it, and are in fact as absolutely nothing at all, so much so that they can only bear to have a minute glow of it clothed within them, without their reverting to nothingness altogether. Their main life force, which they receive from it, however, is not clothed within them, but animates them from outside, so to speak, as a transcending, encompassing manner. There was a lot of Kabbalistical speak for saying this is an extremely powerful light, an extremely powerful connection. This is as Hashem. This is the meaning of the verse, and God commanded us to fulfill all these statutes in order to fear God. What is the connection? Usually you have to fear God, and then you can do all the statutes. Why does it say, do the statutes in order to fear God? Because when we think about the connection that we're forging with God through this Torah study, it brings us a great sense of...
God a mitzvah?
Yes.
I don't fear him.
So we have to work on that. That is one of the hardest mitzvahs for us to live and us to do.
Very hard mitzvah.
It is a very hard mitzvah, and very briefly what I'll explain is, the mitzvah of fearing God can exist on a few levels. If I describe to you what hell looks like, what the afterlife looks like if we don't follow what God says, that's a certain level of fearing God. I'm feeling the punishment. Or I could describe to you God's greatness, and then you're afraid of God's power. Well, if I go again, that's a very immature version of fearing God. What fearing God truly is, and what we're describing here, is a sense of awe. A-W-E.
So fear is awe.
Fear is awe.
Is there a difference between the two words, awe and fear?
Yes, there is a difference. Yes.
Because every morning we say, I bow toward your holy sanctuary in awe of
Yes.
you.
Yep. There is a difference, and there's it's a hierarchy of sort of development, but we can discuss that later. Finishing up, on page 14, Vayir Gedela Zu Amra Ki Ein Chachma Ein Yira Vater Nika Esla the Tara Ledarta Kameish Yisbar Bakamacher. Regarding this great fear, our sages say if there's no fear, wisdom, there is no fear. In this concept, wisdom represents Torah, study, and fear, the higher level of awe of God, which can be reached only by the way of the Torah. By contrast, statement, if there's no fear, there's no wisdom. First, a lower level of fear, which is a prerequisite for Torah today. I'll explain this in a second. In relation to this level of fear, the Torah is called the gateway to the courtyard, i.e. the sole means of entering the courtyard, the higher level of fear, as explained elsewhere. There's a very enigmatic sentence in Ethics of Our Fathers. It says, if there's no wisdom, there's no fear. If there's no fear, there's no wisdom. Or the other way around. There's no fear, there's no wisdom, no fear. So it's a self-fulfilling. How do you do it? So commentaries explain, especially according to Chassidus, that we're talking about two different levels. You cannot learn Torah without a basic fundamental sense of awe of what you're about to do, right? Because if I learn Torah, I have all the authors on my shelf, and I have, J.K. Rowling, and I have this one and that one, and I have God's Torah, that's not Torah study. That's a problem, that's a negative thing to do. I have to have a certain sense of awe, a certain sense of respect when I first study Torah. That's a very, very low, very fundamental idea. But once I'm learning Torah, I can tap into this much greater level of awe of the connection that I'm forging here. That can only happen once I learn Torah, because then I can appreciate what I'm actually doing, right? So before someone learns their first word of Torah, they have no reference for what this is, and therefore they can't have this higher level of Torah. That's how you have this sort of, if there's no fear, you can't even start learning Torah, but without Torah study, you can never get to this higher level of awe and fear. This is in a bracket, and the Alter Rebbe ends off, if you don't feel this, don't worry about it. As he finishes off, Ella de lav kol mecha sevilda yira kazum, ach gamad loy sevil mechi kal yirzu, loy minei loy mektasim pichisus, erech nafshe b'shosha makera, madregas achtenim de asesferes ta'asiya, in yirzu makevis to be'maisek mish berla kaman. If you don't feel this, because as all of us around the table, starting with myself, we're not the loftiest souls that can relate to God on this level. I don't really know this whole chapter that we explained in the last hour and 20 minutes is your words. Do I really appreciate what that kind of connection means? No. My soul and me are living in 2026 of America, but don't worry about it. Even if you don't fully connect to this, it's so powerful. As we finish off in English, not every mind, however, can sustain such a fear, yet even he whose mind cannot bear such a fear, nor even a minute part of it, because the root of the source of the soul derives from the inferior level, the lower gradation of the 10 spheres in the world of Asiya. Even he should not be deterred from the actual performance of the mitzvah of the Torah and mitzvahs for want of this fear, as we'll explain further. I will leave that for now. Just to give us a picture of where we're up to, the Alter Rebbe spent a few chapters describing how everything is God, and God is everything. But if everything is God, what's truly God, and what's the external levels of God, and what's the internal levels of God? So now we're explaining how Torah and mitzvahs is the internal level of God. And therefore, when we learn Torah, and when we do mitzvahs, and especially when we learn Torah, we are connecting to the innermost levels of God. Next chapter, in chapter 24, he's going to discuss the opposite side of that. How when we sin, we are severing ourselves from God, so to say. We are going to the opposite extreme, and we're doing the worst thing possible for our soul. And then in chapter 25, he's going to tie it all together, how that's how we can meditate, and that's how we can, no matter how much knowledge you have about God, if you can think about this, you can overcome any obstacle and do any mitzvah, as we'll continue to explain. Thank you everyone for joining.